Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And we are going to just jump right into today's episode.
I was like, I'm excited.
I was going to say, normally we have a bunch of announcements and stuff. All the things that we've talked about for the last couple of weeks as far as upcoming events, check our show notes. It's there, I promise. And we will see you at those events. But we really want to get to our guest today. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, you can totally see Diane's super excited face. This is one of her favorite topics to cover. She's also got her matching t-shirt on that goes with the photo that's behind her. I think this is great. So today we are super excited to have joining us Josh Taylor, who has the YouTube channel Wild West Extravaganza, which if you want to know stories about pretty much anything that's happened in the Wild West, Josh's YouTube channel is a great resource. He's got so many fabulous videos on there. He does his homework, and it's so much fun to watch and listen to the stories that he tells. And of course, talking about the Wild West is always fun anyway, because when we talk about all the weird, crazy stuff that happened out this way once upon a time. So we would very much like to welcome Josh to the show. So thank you, Josh, for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And today's topic, again, one of Diane's very favorites, although you should tell our listeners how you came by your t-shirt, because
it's we went to Fort Sumner with the kids. Actually, it was a trip to Carlsbad, but we had to go out of the way so my kids could stand in front of Billy the Kid's grave, where my brother and I had taken our pictures, probably about the same age. I think they were like maybe 14 and 10 maybe. But yeah, the t-shirt was the only one left, and it's a size 2X, so I sometimes wear it for pajamas. But I had to find it, make sure, get it all washed, and so I could wear it tonight, because it wouldn't be proper to wear anything but my Billy the Kid t-shirt.
So as
I
folks
feel out of place because I'm wearing my Pat Garrett t-shirt.
Oh no,
I'm just joking.
I love it. So Josh is not on camera with us. So if you are watching on YouTube, you'll see Diane and myself. But Josh, we can hear him very well. He is going to, because he's done so much research and stuff, he is actually going to talk us kind of through Billy the Kid's life and story. And we thought this was such a great opportunity to do, especially since we just covered Victor Lustig, another man whose real life intersected with his legend, and it's sometimes very hard to dig out what's true and what's assumed to be true. And Billy the Kid has definitely, for as short as his life was, because he was not very old when he died, he created quite a legend for himself with his short-lived life.
Absolutely.
So why don't we start with kind of whatever you know about the very beginning of Billy's life, where he came from and how he even got to be the criminal he was.
Sure. So one of the things I think it's important to point out with any discussion when it comes to Billy the Kid, we know very little about his life, especially his early life. So you can kind of take everything you think you know about Billy the Kid and pretty much just throw it out the window. The narrative is he was born in either Ireland or New York City, and all that. That very well may be the case. It just hasn't been proven yet. You'll sometimes come across a baptismal record from New York City, a Catholic church. A lot of people will point to and say, yeah, see, this is Billy the Kid. It's got his mother's name is Catherine, father's name is Patrick McCarty. But as if I'm not mistaken, they've also located a death certificate for that kid once he got older, and absolutely wasn't Billy the Kid. So Billy first kind of pops up on the radar, not in New York City, but Indianapolis. He's living there with his mother and his brother in, I believe it's 1867 or 1868. You can find his mother on a city registry or directory. Excuse me. We still don't see him by name though. We know that was definitely Catherine McCarty, because living very close nearby there was a guy named William Antrim, and those two would end up getting married. They actually moved down to Wichita, Kansas in 1870. I'd have to check my notes to see how long they lived there. Possibly made a detour to Colorado And finally, they head down to New Mexico. And that's where we finally see Billy's name actually for the first time in print. It's when his mother, Catherine McCarty, and William Antrim get married. He and his brother are listed as witnesses.
Good
So I mean
witnesses.
that's the, and by that time he's, shoot, let me check real quick, make sure I
Yeah.
got the date right when they got married.
And do you know where in Colorado or just
Yes, they got married in Santa Fe.
okay?
So they got married on March 1st, 1873. And that's we also don't know exactly when Billy the Kid was born.
Right.
I think 1860 is a good estimate. So he would have been around, 13, 14 when his mother got married to William Antrim. They don't stay in Santa Fe. They end up going further south to Silver City. They move there, and that's where they live until Catherine's death. I believe it was in 1874. She died probably from consumption.
Hmm. They weren't very, very long then before she died.
Right. I guess they were living, as my grandma might say, living in sin prior to that in Kansas. But they were definitely together. I mean, they were traveling as a family. Once, and the from what I've read of the eyewitness accounts, as far as Billy living in there in Silver City as a younger guy, his mother loved to dance. He loved to dance. He was a big reader. Um, really doesn't look like he got into a whole lot of trouble while Catherine was alive, but after she died, obviously that's when things kind of went downhill. He was a very young teenager and started hanging out with the wrong people. He got busted stealing some butter, I think it was, of all things.
Oh, geez.
And then a little while after that, he was hanging around with an older guy. I'm not sure how much older, but this ne'er-do-well. And the guy had robbed a one of the Chinese residents there of Silver City, stole a bunch of clothing and a pistol. Well, some of the stuff he pawned off on Billy, told him to hang on to it. Billy at that time, he was kind of being passed around from family to family. When this was going down, he was staying in a boarding house. The lady that ran the place, she found the stolen clothing. She
Oh,
called the
no.
sheriff, Sheriff Harvey Whitehill. He arrested Billy, put him in jail. This was really just like a scared straight tactic more than anything. They weren't planning on doing anything serious, right? They were just going to hold him in jail for a day or two.
Right.
Billy didn't want, by the way, his name was Henry. I keep calling him Billy. So,
Oh, no, that's fine. I was gonna say I
yeah,
know his real name was not Billy the Kid. That
right,
became
right,
his
right.
name.
So my bad. Yeah, Henry McCarty. We don't know if he had a middle name. We don't know any of that. Just Henry McCarty. So at this point, at this time, he's still Henry. He doesn't like being locked up in jail. I can't blame him. So he escapes almost immediately and makes his way to Arizona as fast as he possibly can. Now, his stepfather, William Antrim, had already moved to Arizona. So I think
Mm,
Billy was probably thinking he could maybe hook up with him. Stepfather didn't want nothing to do with him. So Billy starts hanging around with more bad people. That's where he starts stealing horses in Arizona. Ends up kind of getting crossways with a guy known as Wendy Cahill. Sort of a loudmouth bully. He would kind of mess with the kid a lot, call him names.
mm.
They finally got into it one day. Wendy started beating on the kid pretty bad, and Billy or Henry pulled out a pistol and killed him dead. Now, as far as the name Billy, he did start going by his stepfather's name while he was in Arizona. So they started calling him Kid Antrim, Billy Antrim, William
Oh.
Antrim. Now, as soon as he killed Wendy Cahill, once again, he hauled butt straight back to New Mexico. And that's when he took on the alias of William H. Bonney. So that's why a lot of people know that nickname. A lot of people don't realize that wasn't his real name. Um, I assume the H probably stood for Henry.
For
I
Henry,
assume the
yeah.
William, maybe William Antrim. To this day, nobody knows where the Bonnie name came from. It could have been his mother's maiden name. There's even a theory that there was a guy that wrote a bunch of like pulp fiction type novels, and he was a big reader when he was a kid. The guy's last name was Bonnie. Would
Oh,
write these adventure stories. There's a theory that maybe Billy was a big fan of that guy, so he took his name. But yeah, that's when he came back to New Mexico and fell in with a group of outlaws, John Kinney and another guy named Jesse Evans. And eventually they made their way to a place called Lincoln County, New Mexico, and that's the rest is history after that.
Well, a lot of people don't even really understand what happened in the Lincoln County War because they make it sound like it was a war between outlaws or whatever, but it was more of a faction between the an Irish merchant and an English rancher. Or am I just like going by the movie and what
I'm going to be
read?
completely honest with you. There is a lot of complexity involved in the Lincoln County War. Like my show, The Wild West Extravaganza, just does different topics on the Old West, right? I could have started a podcast, or anybody can start a podcast on just Billy the Kid, and you will never run out of stuff to talk about. When it comes to the Lincoln County War, especially, it is so complex. I don't really think most people understand, and I don't fully comprehend what it was all about. Essentially, okay, so everybody's seen Young Guns and William Murphy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so William Murphy he was a career military man. Okay, there was a fort nearby. There was a fort nearby the town of Lincoln called Fort Stanton.
Okay.
Am I getting that right? I think I'm getting that right. Sorry if I
No,
think
you're
it's Fort
okay.
Stanton.
I was like, I can look too, and I was like,
And and that's where Murphy was stationed at. And at one point in time, he was actually the commander of the entire fort. He mustered out of the military and kind of he still hung around a lot. Like he would give payday loans to soldiers there at the fort. He got contracts to provide the army with beef. Pretty sure every cow the army ate in New Mexico was stolen. It's basically the guys I mentioned earlier, Jesse Evans and John Kinney. They were basically stealing livestock, selling it to Murphy, and then he would sell it to the army, right, for a profit.
of course.
And he started getting, he eventually got kicked out of the fort. So, let me back up a little bit. Sorry, it's been such a long time since I've talked about all this.
No, that's okay. And it was Fort Stanton, by the way.
Okay, great. So his Murphy's original partner was a guy named, oh gosh, man, Fritz. It was a guy from Germany. He too was a career military man. They served together during the war. And he ended up getting sick. He ended up dying. Believe it or not, they had secured the services of a lawyer named William Tunstall. Not William Tunstall, McSween. Sorry. So McSween, he was actually working for Murphy to see to it that his partner Fritz, the German guy, when he died, to make sure that the next of kin got his life insurance policy. It's $10,000. Nobody knows what happens to that money. Some people think maybe McSween embezzled it. So that's really where the origins of this conflict begin. Murphy ends up getting kicked out of Fort Stanton because he has another protege after the death of his partner. He takes in this younger soldier named Dolan. Dolan's a hothead. As soon as he musters out of the army, he ends up shooting. I don't think he killed him, but he shot an officer there at Fort Stanton.
Oops.
Long story short, they're kicked out of the fort. They own several businesses there in the town of Lincoln, and then all of a sudden, here comes this young English guy named Tunstall, John Tunstall. He starts buying businesses too. They start clashing. They start butting heads.
And as we know, the English and the Irish have not traditionally gotten along well.
Yeah. And, Billy was basically hired on as muscle for John Tunstall. They knew a shooting war was likely to break out sometime soon. The Murphy Dolan faction, they had the guys I mentioned earlier, Jesse Evans, John Kinney. They had all kinds of outlaws working for them. They also had the sheriff in their pocket, Sheriff Brady. And then you had Tunstall. He starts muscling up too. He starts hiring guys. And one of them is this young guy, William H. Bonney. Contrary to popular belief, they probably didn't know each other all that well. I think Billy only worked for Tunstall for maybe 3 weeks or so before his death. But yeah, then Tunstall ends up getting killed by the Murphy Dolan faction. A lot of his employees and people that were friendly with him. They form a group known as the Lincoln County Regulators, and they get deputized and they go to war with the Murphy Dolan faction. And that would be the Lincoln County War.
It totally, and now you know why it's lent itself to so many stories
Yeah, exactly.
since then.
Yeah.
Books,
Oh, yeah.
movies, everything.
And I don't know how much the Irish English thing factored into it, to be honest with you. I don't really think either side, it wasn't like good versus evil.
Right.
Both sides were doing some shady stuff.
Hmm.
Tunstall, in a letter he had written to a family member, basically said that he was planning on having complete control of Lincoln County soon, that every dollar that was made there, I think he said he was going to get 50 cents out of every dollar that was made. He wanted a
Wow.
monopoly as well. So both sides were basically fighting over a monopoly of all the businesses and
Right.
The
criminal
county,
element.
right. Which, yeah, that makes way more sense from a fighting standpoint, like why they would be even fighting in the first place.
Yeah, and I
For
think
the
a lot
control.
of times young guys just want to, fight. You know what I mean? To be perfectly honest with you, I mean, you think of like every war throughout history, how much does that 18-year-old or 19-year-old that volunteers to fight, how much do they know about the
Right.
socioeconomic ramifications of the global whatever, you know what I mean?
Right.
They're just doing their patriotic duty. Billy just happened to, I honestly think he just happened to know these guys that were loyal to Tunstall and he joined in with them. He wasn't the leader of the Regulators at first. It wasn't until really after the war was over, that he kind of gained notoriety. And let me also preface all this. A lot of times when I say this type of stuff, people think that I don't like Billy the Kid for some reason. I think he was great. I mean, everybody's fascinated with Billy the Kid. I try to stay as accurate as I can. I know I messed up a
Right.
lot of the facts with the Lincoln County War, but
No, from what I read, I think you were pretty dang close.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be a very confusing conflict. Long
It
story
was,
short,
yeah,
two factions fighting each other. The
it was more of a political war between the
Yeah,
English and the Irish than anything else.
A power
and
grab.
Yeah.
and you had guys up in the capital, the territorial capital, Santa Fe, known as the Santa Fe Ring. They were headed up by a guy named Thomas Catron or Catrone. I always forget how to say his name the right way. Uh, they were just, corrupt politicians, and they were trying to get a piece of the pie too.
Mm-hmm. That
Yeah,
sounds pretty familiar.
because you had
Yeah.
mentioned that in your video, and I had to I wrote like a page of notes after listening to your video, and I had never heard of the Santa Fe Ring, so I'm going to have to
Oh yeah,
lift that up and see. Because yeah, there's corrupt politics everywhere.
man, I think it's a prerequisite for the job sometimes.
Yeah, if you're too honest, they don't want you.
Nah, they gotta
If
get some
you're-
dirt on you.
Exactly. I think that's the only way you get into politics anymore.
Absolutely.
But so Billy was young, but
Yes.
ambitious, obviously, and he was hanging out with the wrong people, but the right people for him, honestly, because I think
Yeah.
he sounds like the kind of, especially because he was a young man, like he needed to be able to move around and like just getting a job and settling down, I don't think was his idea of a way to live his life. I feel like he was like, oh no, we'll go rustle up some cattle, or we'll, defend somebody that we barely even know, but my friends know, so I'll just do this. Like, it doesn't sound like he had any interest whatsoever in like taking on a normal job and a family and settling down and trying to live the respectable kind of life that maybe he would have if his mom hadn't died, but
Yeah. Probably not at first. Billy liked to have a good time, first
Mhm.
and foremost. And, like you said, he was very young. The
Mhm.
Lincoln County War ended officially, when was it? 1878.
Oh, and he died
So
in 81, right?
81, right.
Mhm. So
So,
just a few years after.
right. So he's most likely still 17 years old when this war breaks out. He's 17 years old. That's crazy
Mhm.
young. He's 18 once it's over. And maybe he's 18. But
Close to it.
yeah, he liked to dance. He didn't drink, believe it or not, but he loved to dance. He loved to sing. He loved music. Apparently the ladies loved him in return. I know it's hard to tell looking at that picture behind you, Diane, but they say he was a good-looking kid.
Oh, he's definitely got a charm about him. Like,
Yeah,
you can totally see, I bet when he smiled, like a regular smile, especially if he was smiling at the ladies, I'm sure, he caught on real quick.
well, his alleged girlfriend, Paulita Maxwell, she remembered when that picture was taken. She said it did not do him justice at all. She said she hated that picture. Said he didn't even dress like that, which is ironic because when they make movies, they always make
Dress
the
him like
character
that.
look like that picture. So he didn't dress like that at all. So I think one of the theories is he had just came out off the range, maybe from stealing some horses or cows or something, and he just stood in front of the camera, and there we have it.
And they
But
snapped a picture.
yeah, but I think he was just he was a confident, very confident young man. I don't think he was stupid at all. I think he was probably fairly intelligent. He was street smart,
Mm-hmm.
fluent in Spanish, got along very well with Hispanics that lived there in New Mexico. They all loved him. I mean, very charismatic. But yeah, I don't know if he ever had any like ideas of settling down and starting a farm or anything like that. But I think once he kind of got swept away with the Lincoln County War, there really wasn't any turning back. He tried to go straight. There was a time when he testified against the people he was fighting against during the Lincoln County War. He testified in court against several of them. None of the charges stuck. Everybody got off pretty much scot-free.
Yeah.
And they basically, in a lot of ways, they did make him out as kind of a scapegoat,
Mm-hmm.
that he was this just bloodthirsty killer and murder and all that.
Well, and he was the new kid on the block at the time too. If he'd only been there for like 3 or 4 weeks, he was the new kid.
Well, yeah,
just come in.
And if Tunstall hadn't been killed, and which put the not McSween, the other guys in charge.
Murphy.
Yeah, Murphy.
And that's another
charge.
thing I forgot to mention. Murphy really wasn't involved very much during the actual war. He was there during the buildup. He had a pretty severe drinking problem. It started affecting his health very bad. So I don't believe he was even living in Lincoln County when the war was raging on. At that point, his protege, Jimmy Dolan, had taken everything over. So It was Dolan at the forefront of the known as the Murphy faction, aka the House, they called themselves sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. And yeah, that's it, man. After the Lincoln County War, the regulators kind of sort of drifted apart. They stuck around for a little bit. They started stealing horses and selling them over in Texas Panhandle. When they were on their way back, they steal some Texas cows, sell them in New Mexico, and on. Billy never robbed any trains. He never robbed a bank. He never did a lot of the classic outlaw stuff you hear about, like Butch Cassidy and Jesse James and all these guys. He stole some horses and cows. He probably stole a lot of them, but
he's a cattle rustler.
Pretty much everybody was back in those days to a certain degree. He just got caught for it, and as his reputation began to grow, that's when you start getting blamed for a lot of stuff. Maybe you didn't do, maybe you did, but yeah, I don't want to paint Billy the Kid as some sort of angel or anything like that. He was guilty. He was a killer. He was a thief. He was all the things. But a lot of worse people out in the old West than Billy the Kid.
Oh, definitely. So like in your the podcast you did, and of course you went into Bushy Bill Roberts, but we don't need to talk about him. And there have been
we can talk about him.
many movies about Billy the Kid. And of course, I mean, it's going to be really hard for anyone to believe that Young Guns was not my favorite. How did the movie, I know Hollywood can take its own creative license, but how close do you think the movie was? I know there was a Chavez, there was a Doc Scurlock, there was a Arkansas Day Rudabaugh, and of course, was it Charlie? Is it Baldry that's buried with him?
Yep.
So I mean, a lot of the names were pretty, gosh bless it, accurate, at least in the movie.
Well, I don't know if you're aware of my history with Young Guns. So I played Young Guns at recess when I was a kid. I had the Bon Jovi soundtrack.
I love it.
All right. This was my movie
Yes.
for a great deal of my childhood. This was it. You
Oh,
know,
it was mine when
I
I was in my 20s. So yeah.
yeah, hey, there you go. I had every line memory. I want this kid Zach always had to be Billy the Kid when we played Young Guns, and it kind of made me mad. So I was always either Doc or Chavez. Chavez was cool because he had knives and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was a big fan. I still am a big fan of Young Guns. They're supposedly making a Young Guns 3, and I'm here for it.
No. I know.
Yeah.
I was so
But
excited.
yeah, so I mean, when it comes to accuracy, you know how the movies are. They get stuff right, they get a lot of stuff wrong. I
Well,
want to
there's the saying when you're writing a script. So this is true
yeah.
for stage scripts and the movie. You
Uh,
don't let the facts get in the way of your story,
there
Yeah.
you go. Exactly.
which is why when we see movies that are anything historical in a lot of cases, there's always something that's not right.
Always, always. And I used to really hate that, but the older I get, the more I understand it and I even embrace it.
Mhm.
It's like, just entertain me. I can learn the history somewhere else, just entertain me.
Yeah.
But, with Young Guns 1 in particular, I'm not aware of any other movie that portrayed the Lincoln County War, you know? And I thought they did a good job there. Obviously, Mr. Tunstall, I don't know why I decided to get all formal with him there. John John Tunstall, he was only 24 years old when he was killed.
Oh
So
wow. Yeah.
you see Young Guns 1 and you think he's this older
Old
gentleman,
man.
right? Yeah. Nope. 24 years old. He had some of the guys working for him were older than he was. I want to say Dick Brewer, who was the head of the regulators, the first leader of the Lincoln
Mhm.
County regulators. I think he may have been older. I'd have to fact
I
check
think
that.
he was the older one. And then of course, if people haven't watched the movie, shame on you. But that was Charlie Sheen,
Yep.
Emilio's brother, who played that. But there was the other movie, Chisholm, John Wayne's Chisholm, that went into it just a little bit,
Oh,
but not to
I
the
haven't seen
point.
that in such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not Young Guns. I mean,
Yeah.
um,
That's John Wayne, right?
yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so obviously in Young Guns, Billy and Tunstall had a very close, almost like a paternal relationship. This is the
Yeah.
guy that took him in that was mentoring him. It
Right.
doesn't look like there's any evidence that was necessarily the case.
Well, it doesn't sound like he was that much older than Billy himself, to be honest.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. And some of there was a very large Hispanic faction of the regulators, so their numbers would fluctuate. So if you watch, like Young Guns, and it looks like there's a core group of like 10 guys or something like that. In all actuality, sometimes there was 60 or so Lincoln
Mm.
Oh
County
wow.
regulators. It just all depended. Now that core group that you do see, interestingly enough, they had a nickname for themselves. They called themselves the Ironclads. Kind of cool. Sounds like a band. But
Yeah.
so that core group you do see in Young Guns 1, even Dirty Steve, real life guy. There's gosh, I can't remember the actor that played him in Young Guns 1. The guy that always had the big thing of chewing tobacco in his
Oh
cheek.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
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 Even he was he's very rarely mentioned in the historical records. He was there for the gunfight with Buckshot Roberts. I believe he was in the Battle of Lincoln, but I don't think anybody knows where he came from or what happened to him afterwards or anything like that. Of course, there was Charlie Bowdry. He survived the Lincoln County War. There was Doc Scurlock. Doc Scurlock, when the Battle of Lincoln, at the end of Young Guns 1, the army shows up. At that time, Doc Scurlock, he was in charge of the regulators. So Billy is still just a guy that's there. He's not
Mhm.
in a leadership role whatsoever.
Yeah, we talked. There was another video you had done on Doc Scurlock,
Yeah,
and I found it fascinating that he survived. So he didn't die like they showed in the movie, correct?
correct. That would have been the guy that's buried there. Right. Yeah.
In Riverside. He's buried in Riverside.
Well, no, I'm sorry. Uh, what I meant to say was, so when you see Doc dying in Young Guns 2,
Yeah.
the way he died, that was basically he was just that was how Charlie Bowdry died.
Mm.
The guy that's buried there with Billy the Kid.
Oh, okay.
So that when you see We can get to that later, but yeah, Doc's death was just a sort of a stand-in for Charlie Bowdry's death. Charlie dies in Young Guns 1, I believe. If
Yes,
memory
he
serves
died
me
at
correct.
the shootout at McSween's, I think.
Lincoln, yeah. So he actually survived that, went on, uh, start a family, tried to get out of the outlaw life, and he ended up being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Oh no.
Got mistaken for being Billy the Kid, and he got shot and killed.
Now,
Mm.
which one is buried in Colorado? Because you and I were going back and forth, or it was
I think
somebody
you may
that, or
be thinking of the Coes or who's buried in Colorado. I know George
maybe
Coe
it
and his
was,
cousin Frank, they ended up moving to Colorado after the Lincoln County War, but I think they came back to New Mexico.
okay, because maybe it was somebody that was a regulator that isn't the famous, that group, that core group that we know. And I think, because you had mentioned they went to Denver or Colorado, and of course I got excited they could have been at one of my cemeteries.
Yeah.
But I think you said he's up in Denver. And I can't remember. I went back to look, and then I don't know if I lost the
Off the
conversation.
top of my head, I'm thinking Jimmy Dolan, the guy that was the head of the Murphy faction there during the war. I think he may have died in Colorado, and Billy the Kid's brother, Joseph, died in Colorado years and years later.
And I was also telling you in a cemetery here, there's always been legend or whatever. People research that we have, hang on, Rhodey W. McCarty. So it's R.W. McCarty.
All right.
And people who had researched other characters, and the story involves this other madam with R.W. And they said that he was supposed to be like Billy the Kid's cousin. So I don't know if you had ever run into a Rhodey.
No, I haven't. I would say be wary whenever somebody says, this is Billy the Kid's cousin or his descendant. I had somebody email me recently saying that they had talked to somebody that knew Billy the Kid's granddaughter. There, like I said at the very beginning, there is so much we don't know about Billy the Kid.
Right.
We don't know who his actual father was. We don't know his mother's maiden name. We don't know if he himself had fathered any children before he died. And we don't know if he had cousins or anything like that. All we know is that he had a brother named Joseph and a stepfather named William Antrim.
And the other thing that I found fascinating while listening to your podcast, and we were talking about Pete Maxwell and Polita Maxwell and the Maxwell family. And and they're in New Mexico, they're at Fort Sumner, and if everybody's been to Fort Sumner, it's very rustic. There's not much there. It's in the desert.
I was like, it's in the middle of the desert. So
it's in the middle of the desert, yeah. And it's like, I wonder if these Maxwells were related to the Maxwells of the Maxwell Land Grant, and lo and behold, yes. And I was like, wow, so the Maxwells weren't just small-time farmers.
Oh no.
They were like a very well-known, very respected family. And Peter's father, and I had it written down. Lucian, I didn't want to mispronounce it.
Yeah.
He was given a Spanish land grant that equaled like 1,700,000 and some odd acres, which was half of New Mexico and parts of Colorado, for goodness sake. And then when they talked about Fort Sumner, and we think of it being an active fort, which I thought it was an active fort at the time. And then just, I was just quickly looking at stuff. Is like, the reason they were there is the fort actually, closed in 66 or 68. And
I think it's somewhere around there.
Yeah. And then Maxwell's pretty much took it. And that beautiful home of the Maxwells was the officers' quarters at one time, which was why Billy was at Fort Sumner, not necessarily a fort anymore, and at Pete Maxwell's, which that sort of was very, very interesting to me, the association of the Maxwell family and Billy the Kid. I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. I don't know when Billy first arrived at Fort Sumner, but like I said earlier, and now, like you said, Fort Sumner was an actual military installation. closed. I want to say it was 1868. If you've ever heard of the Bosque Redondo, that was Fort Sumner. Okay, that's where they stuck the Navajo after the long walk. Kit Carson is a long, horrible history there at
Yeah.
the Fort Sumner area. Um, by the time Billy shows up, it's no longer a fort. It's Pete Maxwell and his extended family. I want to say they had a population of around 200 or so there at Fort Sumner, majority Hispanic. Billy got along very well with and Pete Maxwell, they called him Don Pedro. His sister was Paulita. So they're half Hispanic by birth, and I don't know culturally, but I'm assuming culturally they were also pretty, ingrained in the Hispanic community as well.
Of course, they were surrounded by it.
Right,
That's
right.
where they lived. Exactly.
Everybody there was speaking Spanish. So where were we?
Oh,
Fort
just the
Sumner.
connection with the Maxwells, and
Oh
that
yeah.
it was just
And I need to look. That's something that I am not as well versed in as I should be. Like you said, it was a huge land grant. I don't know where all that money ended up going. I don't know how much money Pete Maxwell retained. I don't know really any, because when you like, I've never been to Fort Sumner. From what I've seen, it doesn't look like there was a whole lot of money pouring out of that place. You know what I mean?
No.
no,
I
it,
want
yeah.
to. I think a lot of the people that live there probably weren't very well off. Pete Maxwell, his mother, his siblings, they had a big giant house there, but I'm not sure. I don't think anybody else was living that way over at Fort Sumner.
No,
Probably not.
Yeah, it looks
Yeah.
pretty. When we went, it looked. I have a feeling it looked pretty much like it did then.
Mm-hmm.
It's not developed like some places in New Mexico are, and yeah, and the cemetery is for
It's
as
dirt.
many famous people who are buried there. It is dirt and cactus, and that was another thing we were talking about as far as cemetery, since it's a cemetery podcast.
Right.
There have been so many things, legends or whatever about Billy the Kid. Of course, the whole he's not there. But then also there was where did I just read it? There was a flood, and there was a possible chance that somebody said that, it was in your, that's where I read it. It was in your email newsletter.
All
That
right.
there was a time that they were saying he could have washed away. I can't imagine that much water being in New Mexico at one time. But
Flash floods happen in New Mexico. They do. And they're a little scary.
But then also, because it was the Fort Cemetery, the soldiers who were there, and this was interesting, the soldiers who were there, and if you want to discuss that, 'cause it was actually pretty interesting how they decided all the
Right. So,
Yeah.
Billy the Kid, he's shot and killed at Fort Sumner in July of 1881. Excuse me. Prior to the Maxwells and Billy the Kid and all that, like you said, it was a military installation, so there were soldiers buried in the graveyard, the Fort Sumner graveyard. Don't remember how many soldiers were buried there, 20 something, I think like 21 or 22. And then as it became a civilian town, civilians were buried there as well. The Maxwell family members were buried there. Billy the Kid's buried there. His two pals, Charlie Bowdry and Tom Folliard, they were killed before he was. So he was essentially just buried with them. So, like you said, there was a big flood. I believe it was 1905 or 1906. It's very close to is it the Pecos River?
Yes.
Yeah, so the river flooded over.
Looking.
The cemetery, I believe, was covered in several feet of water for something like 2 weeks. And the common,
like 4 feet. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, the common narrative for as far back as I can remember, what I have always heard and read was that we don't know where Billy the Kid's buried because when that flood occurred, a lot of caskets and bodies were washed away. Okay. Sorry, I pronounced wash with an R. My bad.
That's okay.
But
it's the
so,
Pecos River.
Pecos. All right. So then skip ahead after the flood, a guy gets a contract. Basically, the government wanted to reinter the soldiers that were buried there at Fort Sumner at the Capitol in Santa Fe. So this guy, he got the contract. He went down there, and it was his job to figure out where the soldiers were buried, dig them up, identify them if possible, and then move them to Santa Fe. So this was in 190. Give me 1 second. I'll tell you exactly.
I'm just looking it up because I was trying to
Yeah.
figure out when it
So
happened.
this was in 1906 when he goes down there. So this is right after the flood. This is like a year after the flood.
The flood was in 1904.
There you go. So 2
Yeah.
years after the flood. That's close. So and by the way, when Billy was buried, when he was originally buried, there was just a cross, a wooden cross that was made
Mhm.
out of picket fence put over his grave.
Mhm.
Story goes that a bunch of drunk, either cowboys or soldiers, used it for target practice. And by 1883 or 1884, it was already gone. Like, so
Within a year or two of his death, yeah.
yeah. So by the time this guy, his name was Charles Dudrow, by the time Dudrow arrives, there's no markers for Billy the Kid whatsoever. And he's not even looking for Billy the Kid. He's looking for the soldiers anyway.
Right.
So, and by the way, big shout out to an author named David G. Thomas. He's got an excellent book called Billy the Kid's Grave. He did amazing research on all this. I'm basically just standing on his shoulders, sharing with you what I learned from him. So,
We love a good
y'all,
author.
yeah, y'all def David G. Thomas. He would be great for y'all show. So this guy Dudrow goes down there and he starts speaking with old timers. Remember, this is 1906, so it's been over 25 years since Billy the Kid was killed. It's been longer than that since the soldiers were buried, but there's still people alive that were living there. I mean, think of how many people you know that
Mhm.
are still alive from
Oh, yeah.
25 years ago, right? Pretty much everybody, huh? Right. So there's still old timers that were living at Fort Sumner when, the army was still there. They were living there when Billy the Kid was there, and they remember where a lot of these people are buried. So he's able to successfully dig up every soldier that's buried there, pops open their caskets,
Oh, good for
everything.
him.
And he is also he has a very rough drawn map he's using. I say rough drawn, it probably wasn't very right. It was a good map. He has a map where he identified a bunch of stuff other than the soldiers, and he did mark on his map where the outlaw Billy the Kid and his friends are buried, right? Didn't dig them up or anything like that. Didn't dig up any of the other people, only dug up the soldiers. Now these soldiers were in remarkable condition. Like, he even made a note that, like, there was only one of them that stunk a little bit. Everybody else, smelled fine. And so,
Well, you have to think, other than that flood
right,
in 19, it's pretty arid and dry there.
right, yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
you kind of just dry out.
But
On
the
the floor.
interesting thing is, none of the soldiers' caskets were washed away in that flood, right? And they were all exactly where the old timers remembered them being. And there's no, like, eyewitness accounts of anybody's casket being washed away in that flood. That's just something we started telling ourselves. Like, there is no evidence whatsoever that Billy the
But that
Kid's
happened.
remains were disturbed during that flood. So,
Well, and I'll chip in with this.
sure.
We've during when we first started our podcast, one of our first guests helped to develop a
Oh yeah.
sort of a rescue thing for in Louisiana for when their cemeteries do wash out with their hurricanes and stuff, because they
Oh,
have so
yeah.
many above ground burials.
Mm-hmm.
But what he said was when they're under the ground, they stay under the ground.
Interesting.
Typically,
And that's
don't.
Louisiana.
And that's in
Yeah.
Louisiana. And we'd had this whole discussion about, so all the ones that wash out on a regular basis are in those above ground burials, which was a very common thing to do. Some of it has to do with the fact that they're at sea level, but mostly it was a prestigious thing to just do it above ground. It was a kind of a cultural thing down there for them to do these above ground graves, but they wash out. But we were told that the ones that are buried in the ground, when they have all this flooding and the hurricanes and stuff, which they have all the time, the bodies stay in the ground. They don't wash up. They don't come up. Their caskets stay down there. They're down there forever. It's the ones that are buried above ground. So unless Billy the Kid was buried above ground, which I'm assuming he was at least 4 feet down,
Yeah, at least you would
he's
think.
probably still there.
Well,
Yeah.
and he would be, it would have been about 15
25.
years. Yeah, okay, 25 years. So
Yeah.
he would have been, if he would have even been in a casket to
Mhm.
begin with, it would be gone. pretty much. And he probably would be pretty much gone.
Well, I don't know if the soldiers were there though when they opened the soldiers'
Well, that's
tomb.
true.
That's true. Yeah. And, you know, per eyewitnesses, he was buried in a casket. So we know that much.
Okay.
And yeah, that's a great point from both of y'all. Yeah, I can see definitely some deterioration.
Mhm.
But then again, yeah, the soldiers were still there. That's the remarkable thing. And you know, it was I don't believe Dudrow was able to identify each and every soldier. I think there was an
Right.
officer he identified based on his uniform,
Right. And
but
any insignia that might have been buried with
they
them.
were able to determine that yeah, this guy was a soldier, but we don't know exactly if this was Private
Mhm.
John or Private Paul, whatever.
Now,
But
do you know if the graves for the soldiers were marked before the flood?
no, they were not
So,
anymore. By
okay.
the time Dudge before the flood probably.
Well, I didn't.
I don't know if they were still the markers were still standing before the flood, but yeah,
Right.
when they were first buried, they were marked.
Okay.
Whether or not the flood got rid of all those markers or they had been
Right.
gone for years, just like Billy's, I don't know.
Yeah. Because
Um,
those would wash away, stone or wooden. And a lot of them,
yeah,
if they were marked, could have been wooden ones, which don't stand the test of time in a
right
lot of
now,
cases.
Pat Garrett, bef after the flood, Pat Garrett showed up at Fort Sumner with an author, a guy by the name of Emerson Huff. And Emerson Huff wrote about,
This book,
uh,
if I can, hang on.
oh, you got it?
Yep, if I can figure
It's
out. Yes.
it's not
Put it right
it's
in
in
front of
front
your
of me.
face.
Yeah.
Oh,
So you're
that didn't
probably
quite work
familiar with
either.
this story then. They actually showed up. There you go.
There it is.
Story of an outlaw. They showed up after the flood, and Pat was able to find Billy's grave. I want to say Huff mentioned there was like a little bit of still a mound there where the grave had
Mm.
been. Uh yeah, they gave a nice little toast there in the cemetery. But so skip ahead. It wasn't until a guy by the name of Walter Noble Burns wrote a book called The Saga of Billy the Kid in 1926. It was very, very popular. Like it would have been a Oprah Book of the Month Club book if it was out, I don't know, in the 90s. But very extremely popular, and this skyrocketed Billy the Kid to national fame. He I know people really like to say that he was the most famous outlaw of all time during his life. He really wasn't. You can find articles written about him in newspapers in New York City, and I think even after his death, they printed a article in London. But he wasn't all that famous in his lifetime. It wasn't until Saga of Billy the Kid came out. Then after that, followed all the movies, and that really skyrocketed Billy the Kid to being a famous outlaw. So that's when he finally got another headstone. After Walter Noble Burns wrote that book, a bunch of people pitched in, got a headstone. They put it in the wrong spot. Plus, it got stolen. And you see that headstone behind you, Jenny?
Yep, the
That
pals
was
one.
that was a nice little perfect square. You see how everybody's been chipping away at it over the
Yep.
years. That's why they got that cage around it. So the the first actual stone marker that was placed on Billy's grave, it was in the wrong spot. They went in and got some old timers once again. There were four of them. I'm not even going to pretend to remember their names right now, but these guys, three of the four served as pallbearers after for Billy's funeral. Okay, so they knew exactly where the grave was, right? The fourth
Mhm.
guy, he wasn't at Fort Sumner when Billy the Kid was killed. He showed up like a month or two later. So the grave would have still been very fresh, right?
Right.
So these four guys knew where he was. They were able to determine this is where Billy and Charlie Bowdry and Tom Folliard were buried. That location that these guys determined is the location of the current grave marker. Okay. The one that's behind you.
Yeah, the one that says pals.
Right. So that, if you look at that map that Charles Dudrow had way back in 1905, is within feet of where Charles Dudrow marked Billy's grave.
Perfect.
So there's a very, very good chance he is buried underneath that marker right there. Or if not, within feet of it.
Really close to it, yeah.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
cool.
Now the other headstone, I think is that the one that's behind me? That there was another
Mhm.
headstone before the one before Jenny, and that one was stolen,
Yeah,
correct?
it was stolen twice. And I
Yeah.
think one time it was gone for years and years. It was stolen. I believe they found it in like somebody's pasture somewhere. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was stolen twice. And there once again they got a cage around that sucker now. But
Mm-hmm.
Now
yeah,
that was put in the 1930s, right? About the 1930s.
yeah, and that was the one I mentioned earlier that was originally put in the wrong spot.
Okay, and then if this is the one I'm thinking of, the gentleman who carved that one was from Colorado and he lived in Salida. So I
Oh,
always
okay.
goes, yeah, I always had to see where these Colorado people are buried in hopes that we know where they're buried. But yeah, he was from Salida. I don't know where he's buried, but he was from Salida. So we found that was pretty interesting that he was from Colorado. So
So the large one that says pals, I believe per my notes that was February of 1931.
Okay.
so
And
it's
those
been there
four,
a while.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And those four guys were Jesus Silva, Vicente Otero, Paco Anea, and then Charles Four was the guy that he wasn't actually there when Billy was killed, but he showed up very shortly thereafter.
It came later. Yeah.
Yeah. And
That's,
there he lies.
yeah. So
When you
this
think
is
about
why I think with all the rumors about him not being there,
yeah,
he probably really is still there.
Yeah.
He
yeah,
didn't wash up with the flood unless somebody snuck in and unburied him, which I would think somebody, I mean, there's always been humans living in the area. You would notice if the grave got disturbed.
Almost immediately following his death, there was a big ruckus in the papers. A guy showed up in maybe it was Santa Fe. I can't remember what town it was in New Mexico, and he had Billy the Kid's trigger finger. Okay.
oh,
Started charging tickets for people to come view Billy the Kid's trigger finger. It caused
That's
such a
morbid.
sensation that Garrett ended up traveling all the way back down there to Fort Sumner to make sure the grave was undisturbed. Years later, it turned out the whole thing was most likely a hoax. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, there were other stories. Supposedly, there was some guy trying to sell a like intact skeleton, saying it was Billy the Kid. So there's been a lot of rumors that he has been dug up. Ironically, from what I understand, his mother's grave did wash away
Oh
oh,
in
no.
that's
Silver
bad.
City. I'd have to look more into that. It either washed away or it at least washed the markers away. So they're not
Mm-hmm.
sure if the marker was in the right place.
And
But
just the whole history of the people involved in this, I've
mhm,
always found so fascinating. Even Governor Lou Wallace, who put,
mhm,
the bounty up or whatever on
yeah,
Billy the Kid. And, later on, he went on to write Ben-Hur.
yeah,
And it's
yep,
like just that connection, so many
yeah.
amazing
Whenever Billy the Kid was
connections.
killed, Lou Wallace was no longer governor. He was already out completely out of the state of New Mexico,
Right.
Okay.
or he was basically when Billy was killed, he was like on a promo tour for Ben-Hur, basically.
For his book. Yeah.
So a lot of times you'll hear also that Pat Garrett never received the reward for killing Billy the Kid.
Mm.
And you mentioned earlier that it was Lou Wallace that put that $500 bounty on his head. Well, Pat Garrett did absolutely get that reward. He got it twice, matter of fact. He got it the first time for arresting Billy the Kid in 1880. Billy escaped, of course, and then following year, Pat killed him and he got the reward again. Yeah, it was Governor Sheldon, and I can't remember the guy's name that was the acting governor when Billy was killed. Sheldon was out of the state as well, or the territory. There is a lot of controversy around where Billy the Kid is buried, if he's even buried, if he was ever killed at Fort Sumner. And almost all of that circles back around to the very beginning. We know very little about Billy the Kid, and there's
Right.
so much misinformation out there about him. Like people just repeat stuff they see on movies and they
Hmm.
hear other people say on the it turns out you can't believe everything you hear on the internet. Crazy.
Really? Oh,
Yeah,
Oh
darn
my
it.
goodness.
I know.
Who knew?
But
Oh,
there have been several Billy the Kid imposters later on in years. Obviously, Young Guns 2, Brushy Bill Roberts, and that whole story. And that is just, there's a entire generation of people that are just convinced that Brushy Bill Roberts was really Billy the Kid and that Billy wasn't actually killed at Fort Sumner. But of course, there's no evidence for any of that. There's a ton of so one of the misconceptions is that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid and immediately buried his body before anybody could get a good look at it. Definitely not the case. There are dozens of people that saw Billy's body. They held a wake for him. I mean, the entire the town of Fort Sumner showed up to pay their respects.
I was gonna say, and there's actual documentation about that. So
Correct. There's a ton of documentation, zero documentation supporting any of the, people that claim to be Billy the Kid years later. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I always think it's fascinating because he was only 22, 21, 22 years old.
He was
when
probably
he was,
like 19 or 20, honestly.
yeah, he was such a
Yeah.
young man.
Mhm.
And as you said earlier, he was obviously had street smarts. He
Mhm.
probably was fairly book smart too. If he liked reading and all of that, he
Yep.
probably
Mhm.
had a lot. It would have been interesting to know what his life might have become had he not been killed at such a young age.
I thought about that too. Well, you want to hear my theory?
Yes, I do. I just
All right.
want to know what he would have become if he hadn't
Okay.
died at 20 years old.
So
And gotten
we talked about, okay. So first, let me preface this by saying the co-cousins, they were Lincoln County regulators. And George Coe, I believe, wrote a book called Frontier Fighter years later. He was the only Lincoln County regulator to ever write his own book. Okay. He said that Billy was basically on the verge of getting married and heading down to Mexico when he was killed. So he was very close to leaving. Possibly he was going to be marrying Paulina Maxwell. Who knows? He had a girl in every little village around there, I guess. But according to, I think it was George Coe, it was one of the Coe cousins, said he was about to get hitched, head down to Mexico, and he said if that was the case, he would be a Mexican to this day. Okay. And earlier we talked about Doc Scurlock.
Mm-hmm.
He left New Mexico completely. I mean, the guy lived a very long life. Far as I know, he never fired a gun in anger again for the rest of his life. He was a school teacher. He was a poet. He had many children, grandchildren, had a great life. Historically, however, most of these guys didn't do that, right?
Right. Most of them continued to
right.
break the law.
I, as much as I would love to think that Billy could have escaped down to Mexico and him and Paulita could have a dozen kids and lived happily ever after, I just don't think he would have done that. I think he would have eventually came back to New Mexico, possibly, or even down in Mexico, he could have started causing trouble. Who knows? And he had just gotten by with it so much. And if he would have got by with it again by escaping Pat Garrett, he would have thought he would have been invincible. You know what I mean?
True.
Like,
probably.
this dude was condemned to hang. He was in jail in Lincoln and just blasted his way out. He killed both of the deputies and rode out. He was a free man after that, And he went right back to the place where they had arrested him. The place where everybody knew he was going to be is Fort Sumner. People say, well, I don't think Pat Garrett could have killed Billy because Billy just wasn't dumb enough to fall for any of Pat Garrett's tricks. Well, he did. Pat Garrett literally arrested him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And before that, he ambushed the kid, and one of those names behind you, or both of those names were from Pat Garrett, right? So, yeah, Billy was. I do think he was intelligent. You mentioned that earlier. You can read a lot of the letters that he wrote to Governor Wallace, and he wrote very well. You can read interviews he gave when he was in jail in, gosh dang, not Santa Fe. I can't remember the name of the town, but Las Vegas, when he was in jail in Las Vegas, New Mexico. A very witty, very funny guy, very intelligent, but so confident as well. And when you're that young, you don't think you can die, right?
The arrogance of youth.
He's a little cocky there. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe he would have followed the straight and narrow. There were a lot of guys. This is my alternate history. This is Josh's alternate history. What happens to Billy the Kid? Okay. He goes to Mexico, gets married. He ends up coming back up to the States, stays clear in New Mexico, goes up to Texas, maybe the Indian Territory, maybe Kansas. And like many outlaws before him, he pins on a badge, becomes a lawman. Billy was not going to get arrested anywhere else. He fled from Arizona after killing Wendy Cahill. He probably, he might have got strung up there. I don't know, but everybody else that was involved in the Lincoln County War, they eventually came back to New Mexico and nothing happened to him. Billy
Right.
was fine. He just needed a little bit of time. He had to put time between him and New Mexico. Um, so yeah, a lot of outlaws became lawmen, and a lot of them went back to being outlaws.
Mhm.
Many of them while wearing a badge, honestly.
Yeah, that's true.
So
There's a lot of stories about that.
yeah,
So
But
if
but
there was one thing, one misconception, or one thing you would like people to know or to understand about Billy the Kid
Hmm.
or Henry, what would it be?
it's a good question. One misconception.
Or just one
Yeah.
thing that you would want people to, if they don't remember anything else from this
I mean, he was
podcast, what would it be?
I guess a lot of it comes down to what I was saying earlier about he liked to have a good time. He wasn't robbing banks. He wasn't just going around. I got an episode coming out tomorrow on these guys, the Glanton gang. Okay. These guys were horrible murderers. Have you ever read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy?
Mm-mm.
Is that gang. Uh, Murderers, the foulest
Mm,
rapists and murderers you can
Hmm.
imagine. Billy wasn't any of that. He got caught up in a bad time. He did some bad things himself, and he died a very young man. I mean, if it wasn't for I think I said jokingly once, and I didn't mean this as an insult, but I jokingly said that if Billy the Kid was alive right now, he'd probably be in your driveway still in your catalytic converter. You know, he wouldn't be
probably.
out there robbing
He'd
banks.
be one of those kids.
Right. He'd be like that. What is it? Jesse Pinkman for Breaking Bad, basically. He'd be listening to Eminem and still in catalytic converters,
Yep.
and that's it.
Oh,
Maybe.
poor
He,
Billy.
yeah. Look
Aw.
at him. Look at him right there. That's the prettiest face I've ever seen. But then
No,
again, I'm not on camera, so what's that say about me, huh?
but
No.
I was gonna say it's a sweet face though. I could
Yeah,
see
there
how
you
his
go.
mother would have loved him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she did. I mean, that's a lot of people put the blame on Billy going bad on his stepfather because he fled New Mexico to Arizona to
It's
be with
true.
his stepfather, and William Antrim put him out. He said, "I don't want nothing to do with you if you're that kind of a boy." And maybe if he'd have taken him in, it wouldn't have turned out that way.
Yeah, maybe
Right.
he would have had a better chance of
Yeah,
And we
being
and
wouldn't know
more
who
law
Billy
abiding.
and
yeah,
we would never know who Billy the Kid was.
never
There
heard of
wouldn't have
him.
been a Billy the Kid.
Wouldn't have been a Billy the Kid. Yep.
I don't know. I think he might, in his own cocky way, if he knew about his stories and how his story has changed over the centuries, I
Find it
think he'd be proud of
hilarious.
it. I
Yeah.
think
Oh
he'd be
yeah.
okay with his legacy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He would be amazed if we're still talking about him. Like,
Right?
why are all these people twice my age talking about me? I'm talking about me, not y'all.
Oh
Oh,
no,
please.
I just think it's, we don't live like that anymore, although there's
Hmm.
still some similarities in certain things, but like there is a romance that goes along with learning about people like Billy the Kid and Jesse James and all of these
Hmm.
outlaws of the Old West. It has some very romantic notions, even though at
Absolutely.
the time their lives were really hard and they made them harder for themselves by doing
Hmm.
the things they did.
Yep.
But I think that's what keeps us talking and telling their stories, whether we get all the facts right or not sometimes.
Oh yeah. And I'm definitely getting more wrong than I get right most of the time. But and
Oh,
speaking of Jesse James, he's lauded as a hero in certain circles. A lot of people really look up to him. But when you start digging into Jesse James, guy was a stone cold murderer, right?
Mm,
And then you got somebody like Billy. Chances are you could be around Billy the Kid 24/7 and you are in no danger whatsoever unless you pull out a gun and point it at him.
right.
If you're, I
Or you're
mean,
guarding
yeah,
him in jail and he's breaking
you
out.
might lift your wallet, you know, you might steal your horse, but I don't think you're going to get in any physical trouble unless you press him on it.
right.
A
Right.
lot of those guys, it was the complete opposite. They'd shoot you as soon as you turned your back.
Yeah.
He doesn't strike me as the kind that would shoot you in the back either. Like if he's
Well,
going to shoot you, it's because something happened and he's got to do it to get out of there.
somebody killed Deputy Carlisle at a place called White Oaks, New Mexico.
Mhm.
Um, Here's a we were talking about Young Guns too. There's a great scene where they visit the Lady of the Night there in White Oaks. You remember that scene?
Oh, yes.
Do you know that she was a he? His name was Whiskey Jim.
Hmm.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah,
Well,
and
that just ruined that whole scene.
yeah, but yeah, a guy named Carlisle ended up getting killed. Rudaball later said that it was Billy who killed him, shot him. So, I mean, that was about the closest you could say, cold-blooded murder. Yeah, Billy also helped to murder Sheriff Brady. Uh, Once again, both sides were extremely corrupt in that little fight.
Right.
Um, that's Billy the Kid in a nutshell, I guess.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for
Yes,
taking time
thank
out to
you.
tell us about Billy the Kid
My
and
pleasure.
talking. Folks, if you want to check out, so Josh, your YouTube channel is the Wild West Extravaganza,
Yes.
which is great. And then is your podcast the same name or does it have a different name?
Yep, same thing. It's just the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yep.
Anywhere you listen to audio, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. Yep.
And you do have a newsletter that folks can subscribe to. So we'll link everything in our show notes for you guys
Sure.
to go check out Josh's stuff. But if you, like I said at the beginning of the show, for so much of the Wild West history, Josh's stuff
Oh,
is just phenomenal. And so go check it
Thank
out.
you. Thank you. Thank you. I hope I didn't let y'all down.
No,
Not
not at
at
all.
all.
No, we've
Not
had
at
a
all.
lot of fun. Like I said, this is the perfect follow-up episode to having just covered a different con man who,
Awesome.
like we said, Victor Lustig, we were talking about, he was doing the majority of his crime when like Al Capone and those gangsters were so big and they were more of the cold-blooded killers and stuff
Mhm.
that this man wasn't, even though he kind of ran in those circles.
Yeah.
He's very charming. He got away with a lot. But
Yep.
similar stories, just two different eras. And
And I guess you could
Oh.
say, he's still conning us to this day because we're still arguing about when he was killed and how he was killed and how old he was and all that type of stuff.
Right.
That's true.
We don't want the legend to die.
No, definitely
It's
not.
okay. We'll keep it going. Well,
That's
thank you,
right.
Josh. You have a lovely night. And
Thank you.
folks, make sure you check out the show notes and go check out all of Josh's stuff
Yes,
too.
definitely. We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really helps makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Diane and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.